Good afternoon, welcome back. This is topic 18. We're going to call it nervous system organization, but it's really the first of 3 lecture topics on nerves. Today we're going to do a general overview of different nervous system organizations, and then we're going to hone in and talk a little bit about the vertebrate brain, particularly the human brain, and some of the regions of the brain. Outcomes for this, I would like you to be able to tell me the difference between different types of animals and their nervous system. You're going to use your tree that we developed in the first part of the class to build this. Absolutely pull it out for the first part of these lectures. We're going to look at the types of cells in the nervous system, including the glial cells and the neurons, the nerve cells. We're going to look at the central and the peripheral nervous system, and then we're going to trace a signal all the way through. This is the last of the videos, the last of the lectures that you need for exam 2. However, we will continue the story about nerves in the topic 19 and topic 20. So we'll start, for the final exam material, we'll start looking at how a neuron actually works. By the time you get to the final exam, I want you to be able to synthesize the lectures from nerve 1 all the way to nerve 3. So a little bit of review, the development 2 question that we left off with. I actually ask you to do this across several lectures, and this is something I want you to be able to do by the time you get to the final exam. And a little bit on exam 2 is piece these lectures together. Endocrine 1 and 2, reproduction 1 and 2, development 1 and 2 are all telling a very similar story. You should be able to put all those pieces together. So this is a question, it's an upper level 4 sequencing kind of question that asks you to cross from reproduction 2 all the way through development and put those steps in order. So expect to see a few of these as we practice, and we'll practice in review. A little bit of a big picture of where we're going is nerves are something that we find in most animals, excluding the porifera, because they don't get tissues. As soon as we see tissues evolve on the tree of the Eumetazoa, we start to see nervous or the tissue or the ability to interact directly with the stimulus from the environment. Now, this idea of interacting with the environment is something that evolved way back with the beginning of life. This is billions of years ago. Even bacteria could respond to changes in their environment. Maybe they, if you think back to 115, ramped up their production of lactoperon proteins in response to a change in nutrients. That's something that could have happened. The ability to respond to your environment increases your chance of surviving. You can move away from danger, you can move towards food, you can move toward mate, and it allows you to, as an organism, respond to a dynamic changing environment. Nerves are animals' ability or tissue that allows animals to respond very rapidly to changes in the environment. Something hot touches your finger, you can pull your finger away. And this is animals only within the Eumetazoa. And I want to look at a couple different types of animals and talk about how their nervous systems work. Now, the more complex their bodies are, the more complex their nervous systems are going to be. And this actually correlates as well with the more complex and changing their environment is. Something like a chitin here, this is a type of mollusk, lives in a very simple, unchanging environment. Body plan is simple. Its nervous system is simple. Something like a different type of mollusk, a squid here, lives in a very dynamic, changing environment. It has to hunt, it has to hide, it has to move very rapidly. Its body plan is complicated, its nervous system is complicated. So these nervous systems become more complex and more expensive energy-wise as the organism evolves to live in a more dynamic, complex environment. Now here, I think I don't have any porifera because this here is the evolution of tissues. These are the Eumetazoa. But within the Eumetazoa, we see a varying complexity of nervous systems. We're going to look at the cnidarians. Remember, they are radially symmetrical. They don't have heads. that correlates with them not having a central processing area for their nervous systems. As soon as the bilateria evolved, or bilateral symmetry here, we start to see the concentration of, this is chordates, we start to see the concentration of a nervous system where the nerves and the sense receptors are in the forefront, the part that encounters danger, the part that encounters food first. And then it's much more organized and centralized. We're going to look at all of these. This is a lobster, a leech, a mollusk, this is a flatworm, and then we're going to spend a little bit more time, obviously, on the deuterostomia, particularly the chordates. So I want to show you Cnidaria. These are the simplest animals that we are learning with a nervous system. That here, the metazoa evolves different kinds of cells, but here, the eumetazoa evolves tissues. And one of those tissues is nervous system tissues. But because they have not yet evolved heads and bilateral symmetry, they don't have a one central area where the majority of stimulus are entering into the body. So what we find in the Cnidaria is a nerve net. If I drew it in a jellyfish here is a jellyfish, I would see that there were nerves going all over the place, but there's no one here or here, one centralized location where information is processed. Essentially, if you poke a jellyfish or if you poke a hydra, any of the Cnidaria, stimulus is received by the nerves, and it causes muscle contractions that could hold the entire body in. They actually can't tell where the stimulus is coming from on their body. They have no way of assessing direction, but they can assess that a stimulus was received, and if it was a dangerous one, they can pull away, but they pull away from everything. Now, this does not mean they have no ability to respond appropriately. It's just they respond generally to any stimulus. If you've ever seen jellyfish in a tank, in an aquarium, you'll see that they are often, always, in fact, highlighted in blue light. Blue light versus red light is something these Cnidarian can perceive. They have an ability to take in the stimulus of the color of light, and they interpret that as where they are in the ocean. Blue light to them means that they are deeper down, they'll relax, and they'll live, they'll do the beautiful swimming. If I turn that light to red, that would be interpreted by their receptors on the outside of their body as coming up too high to the surface, where now they're in danger of being eaten by things like birds, and it actually causes them to contract and swim away from the red stimulus. It's a general response, but it's good enough for them, and it keeps them alive. They've been very successful for millions and millions of years. As we move down into the bilateria, I just want to point out the Echinodermata. So here, the bilateria, if you remember, are characterized by bilateral symmetry. They ancestrally have a head cephalization occurring. They have left and right, front and back, up and down. The Echinodermata, as they evolve, the adults evolve to become radially looking. They are still bilateral, but their bodies as adults are fairly radial. That means that what they have is they need to have nerve tissue that runs to each individual arm. This is your standard starfish. But they do have a processing center, unlike a jellyfish, because their ancestors were bilateral. This processing center is called a nerve ring. If you poke a starfish, poke, the stimulus is received. It travels down the arm to the nerve ring, where this nerve ring has an ability to interpret that the poking came to this arm. And this then starfish could withdraw just this arm from a dangerous stimulus, or reach out towards a stimulus that it wanted more of, rather than withdrawing its entire body. These nerve running down the arms send signal to a central processing area. It just happens to be a ring in the center of this organism. So superficially, it looks a lot like a Cnidarian. Very different because its ancestry is bilateral. I want to show you a little bit of the bilateria. There's a lot of variation. It's all kind of, once you get ahead, it means that you have a processing unit. It means that there is a place where stimulus is received and analyzed, and the appropriate response is returned. This CNS I'm going to use over and over again. It stands for Central Nervous System. Your book and a lot of Gen Bio textbooks call these concentrations of nerves a brain that you find. This is a flatworm. This is a leech. This is a lobster. I pulled this because I couldn't find a good one that matched these. But they have these concentration areas. I would prefer you thought about them not like a brain like you have. They're not thinking and feeling emotions with these brains. They are taking in stimulus and returning an appropriate response. So I really would like you to think of them as maybe concentrations of ganglia, concentrations of nerves where some processing can take place. Even these very simple flatworms, so this is a Platyhelminthes. It is in the Lophotropozoa. They have these two nerve cords running down their bodies. They have a concentration of nerves in their head, including the ability to perceive light. They have eye spots. And then they have peripheral nerves that run down the side of their body in sort of a ladder, like a climbing ladder structure. This allows them, if you poke this side, they can retract the side that would be perceiving the stimulus. The stimulus would come in, it would come up and be analyzed and then cause the muscles, the response would come back and cause the muscles to contract. Same thing with an annelid, which was actually earthworm or leech, a little bit more complicated. They have a much more ability to process information, much more ability to send very specific responses. I'm not saying they're thinking about their place in the universe. They don't have a lot of they don't have an ability to think about themselves, but they definitely have a very good ability to respond very quickly to their environment. In arthropods, we find multiple ganglia, multiple different concentrations of little brains that allow them to respond to a specific region of their body. For things like insects and lobsters, they have ganglia here that control the mouth parts, things like taste, response to what to bite on, response to how to clean themselves. And then in insects and other arthropods, we find a second set of ganglia that are controlling the movement of the legs. There's more legs here because this is a lobster. Legs, and then responses that are controlling the response of the tail. These can be slightly independent of each other. If I look at vertebrates within the chordata, so I'm going to skip the basal chordates and look just within the vertebrates, we find the development of a very specific brain and spinal cord. These develop from the dorsal hollow nerve cord that we talked about when we first discussed the chordates. The dorsal hollow nerve cord we've seen in the last lecture folds in from the ectoderm in response to signaling from the notochord. It causes it to fold in and form that dorsal hollow nerve cord. The peripheral nervous system extends from the central nervous system. It is where all of the receptors and ability to respond is. And I want to look at this a little bit because for us, the brain and the spinal cord is very much about storage and dealing and processing with information. The nerves and ganglia in the peripheral nervous system on the sides is about receiving information and activating a response. So maybe something pokes this newt. This newt sends a signal from its peripheral nervous system to its central nervous system, where it tries to understand that. And then it sends a response back, different nerve, response back that causes its arm to contract and move away from the stimulus. Quick note, and I know I'm like jumping around on the phylogenetic tree, but this is the best place I have to compare the nervous system and the lifestyle of an organism. And this is not like, does it have a nice house? This is, what does it have to do to reproduce and keep itself alive? What is its niche? and what's its role in the environment really does have an influence on the evolution of its nervous system. Nervous systems are very expensive. So they use a lot of ATP. We'll see that in the next couple lectures. They take a lot of energy to maintain. So if you're not going to need to respond quickly to your environment, your nervous system is going to evolve to use less energy, to become more simple. This is a chitin. These are both mollusca, but this is a chitin. It's a kind of mollusk that has a hard shell on its back. It has segments, and it lives on the outside of rocks. These live in the Caribbean. You may have seen them. And they kind of sucker themselves to a rock, and then as the waves flow over them, they grip on really tight and they kind of flatten themselves against the rock. As the tide goes out, they move around very slowly and they scrape algae off of the rock. So sort of like a really flat snail. That's it. That's all they do. They don't run, they don't hunt, they scrape or they don't scrape. So their nervous system has evolved to be very simple. It's good enough to perceive that information, but it's not so good that it's wasting energy that they don't need to waste. They're very closely related to squid and octopuses, octopodes, but they live very different lifestyles. A squid is also a mollusk. It's evolved to live in a very dynamic environment. It has to hunt. It has to avoid prey. Lots of things eat squids. It has to be able to perceive its environment. So this mollusk has a very complex, very expensive, energy-wise nervous system that allows it to respond very quickly and reproduce and keep itself alive when it lives in a fairly dangerous, fast environment. In fact, it uses so much energy that some of the mollusks actually have a water pathway that runs over their brain that constantly cools their brain because they're using so much energy it gets warm and it gets a little bit too warm to function. So they need a cooling system on top of it. Closely related, very different lifestyles, very different nervous systems. I'm going to leave you there. Pull out that tree. This is a great time for you to start the long-term potentiation you need in order to start really going over that information. Get it back in your head. Look at those trees. You should be still familiar with Bilateria, Eumetazoa, Chordata, and what makes the chordate special. Now put the nervous system characteristics on your tree. See if you can figure out where nerves evolved. And maybe some of the branches of that tree, what kind of nervous system they have. And I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye-bye.